Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the decline of empires, or not necessarily empires, it could be national decline of a nation such as the United States or Britain or France or anything like that. But talking generally about decline and the causes of decline. Now, the causes of decline in centuries gone by are a little bit harder to determine. We can look back over 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, whatever, and we can surmise. There is some information we have, but we're filling in the gaps by speculation with balance of probability type analysis. Not that that's inaccurate necessarily, but the fine detail of it may not be apparent. And some of the fine details that are causes and have been causes in the past, we can now see today, because in the information age, we know we've got vast amounts of information available to make these assessments as to what causes decline. So people, 100, 200 years from now, will be able to look back at this time, for example, and say, well, this is why this empire or this nation state or this region declined, and where others may have become more prosperous. There's also the issue of relativity. For example, Britain was the world's sort of great superpower in 1890, for example, and had been so for 70, 80 years, almost unchallenged. And yet Britain is today what I think the sixth or seventh sort of ranked economy in the world, even though it is far richer than it was then. So on a relative basis, Britain has fallen from number 1 to number 6 or 7, even though it's a richer country now than it was then. What that means is other countries have become much richer or wealthier than Britain, and therefore have run ahead of Britain, rather than has Britain declined in a net or absolute sense. So really, when we're looking at empire today, we're looking at the Western world, in effect. The Western world, the white European world of Western Europe and North America. That's pretty much or Central and Western Europe and North America. Now, let's look at say 1970 and I've used this sort of measurement many times before, but in 1970, you look at the purchasing power of the worker's paycheck in 1970, compare it to today. Now, the purchasing power has declined by more than half. I think it's getting on for 2/3 at the moment. So that's the decline in purchasing power that's happened in the 50 years. Now, that's a massive decline in what's quite a short space of time. It's taken a mere 50 years to make the pay packet 60% less, has 60% less worth than it did in 1970. That's incredible. Now, it's happened in 3 or 4 areas, I guess, in particular. First is housing and accommodation. That's increased at nearly 3 times the rate of wages. So that's the biggest key factor there in terms of decline. The second decline has been in energy. That's 25 to 30% more expensive in purchasing power terms today than it was in 1970. And fresh food is more expensive, but processed food on a relative basis is cheaper. Although both are more expensive. Overall, food's between 25 and 30% more expensive today in purchasing power terms than it was in 1970. So this is a huge assault on any Western government wants to address that, then they've addressed decline. certainly the decline in purchasing power. Now, the decline in purchasing power has at the same time as purchasing power has been declining, availability of credit has been increasing. So people have access to levels of credit today that they couldn't have dreamed of 50 years ago. I remember the first time I went to buy a block of land, I had to have a deposit for the land of something like 50%, I think it was. Whereas if I bought a house, I only needed, a 25%, for example, a 25% deposit. But later on it came that you could buy a house without any deposit or a 5% deposit. Or you could go to two banks. One would loan you the principal. You could borrow the deposit from the other bank, and so you were in debt for the whole lot. And the idea of being able to put money into the property, whether it land or house and land together, was that you had some sort of equity from the get-go. Now, it meant that you had to be far more rigorous and Spartan in your savings, so you could save up the deposit. But people could save the deposit from their wages. Somebody working at the factory could afford to do that. Maybe they'd stay and live at home for a bit longer, but most people were leaving home at 18, 19, and going out on their own. But back in the day, certainly when I was that age, not everybody did it, but many did. So the purchasing power of the paycheck was much higher there, and gave people a lot of discretion to buy homes and buy houses, afford to get married and have children. Someone working in a factory could afford a dependent wife and 2.5 children. There's no way they could be afforded. They just couldn't even dream of it today. To afford to buy even a shit box in the outer suburbs today, and have a dependent wife and 2 children, you still need to be in the top 10% of income earners. In fact, less than 10% now. And if you want to live in tree-lined streets, you need to be in the nice areas where there's no drug dealers on the corner and that sort of thing, and no gangs running around. Then you need to be 1 in every 230 income earners can afford that. So that's the huge difference between now and then. And again, just to illustrate the point, I'm looking at a house here that's it's got water views. It's in a nice area and that sort of thing. That's sold in 1971 for $25,000. That same house today, with almost no improvements, is sold recently for $4.25 million. That just gives the idea of the sense of the inflation in real estate prices. Here's another one. It was $200,000 in 1991, and it sold just recently for $2.3 million. So in 30 years, the price of the house has gone up tenfold. Here's another one here I'm looking at. In the year 1999, it sold for $400,000, and again, just recently it sold for $2.4 million. So sixfold increase in 20 years. That illustrates the scale of the inflation and on house prices, and the effect that's had on the purchasing power of the paycheck. So when we're looking at decline of empires, where the economic decline and the social trust decline are key factors. Why are people going to fight for their country? Why are they going to do things to help their neighbour? Why will they do things to further the interests of their children and ensure they get a good education and make sure that corruption is stamped out, and a whole range of things. Make sure that merit plays a major part in things, so the brightest people get to the top to make the decisions for the community as a whole, as elected representatives. and so on and so forth. There are a lot of, I mean, it's too big a subject to sort of go into the minutiae on this, but suffice to say that the West is in economic decline because it's debt. Debt, acquiring debt is the only thing that's keeping the standard of living high. It's very artificial. There's a number of factors. One is the debt, and the other is sending manufacturing offshore to use peasant labour offshore to create cheaper goods. And there are consumer goods. Televisions, for example, are much cheaper now in purchasing power terms than they were then, as are some other electronics and consumer goods. I remember buying I think the very first sort of blender and food mixer type kitchen thing, and the price of it, you get so much more today for about the same price as it was 35 years ago. So I think some of those electronic consumer goods are cheaper in purchasing power terms, but the essentials of life, all the essentials of life that you've got to have, they're either far more expensive or the quality is poor. For example, clothing. Clothing is cheaper now, but it needs to be replaced far more often because of the poor quality of stitching, the fabrics, the dyes that they use. So you're replacing it far more often, and other things like mechanics, tools. The quality, if you buy the cheap stuff, the quality is so poor you have to replace it all the time. So you're actually paying more than you would if you bought a quality item. And given only quality items were available years ago, you had to buy it, and therefore you had a better quality product that would last a lifetime. And there are people I know that are in their so in fact recently there was a deceased estate, and they were doing like a sale of the things, and it wasn't far from where we were, and it mentioned tools. So I thought, well, have a look, and there was a few things that I wanted to pick up, and they didn't have what I wanted there. But I noticed that the dates on some of the tools. Some of these tools were 60 years old, and scrub them up. They're as good as the day they were purchased. That's the sort of quality of steel, the quality of manufacture, and so on. So anyway, we're seeing a major decline in economic terms, and again, the whole thing's propped up by debt rather than intrinsic value of what's happening. Same with purchasing shares on the share market or massive real estate speculation, these sort of things. It's all debt funded, and it's caused a ridiculous inflation, of course, in these key assets. People need a roof over their heads, which means rents have gone astronomical. If you make it the average wage in Australia today, and you live in just the median, the average of the average paying rent in like the 2-bedroom apartment, just the rent alone will chew up 50% of your paycheck. That's before you've put any food on the table, before you've paid the electricity or run a motor vehicle or anything like that. That's the extent now. Back in the day, it was 20%, give or take. So in 1970, something like 20% of your income would go on rent. Now it's 50%. That assumes the average wage in both cases. So again, that's an illustration of just how much things have changed. So the decline in empires can be dramatic. You can be invaded or just a huge military confrontation that ends up destroying everything. That's a collapse, or it can be just slowly that the empire or the nation state economically hollows out to a point where it can no longer afford to put a large enough army, enough boots on the ground, well equipped and well trained enough to do the job, or the cost of administering the large empire becomes prohibitive, and so most of the money or economic, the wealth of the empire is going on trying to maintain the status quo without the ability to really service all those costs. But I think the main cause of empire decline is where, and the economic things I mentioned a moment ago, but it's the decline in social trust. If I look at the amount of trust people had in our institutions, even considering the Vietnam War protests and the Summer of Love and the hippies and all that sort of stuff, the general from the majority, the general trust in our institutions was very high. People believed that judges were impartial. They believed that the politicians represented them, and they believed that the police were there to arrest the criminals and so on. Now, whether it was as perfect as some of these people imagined, it was a whole lot better than it is now, where the police have been totally politicized. They're spending more time going after people that oppose the globalist project than they do people who commit crimes. Antifa goons can burn down a Christian church and get away with it, but if you leave a pork chop out the front of a mosque, you can spend 5 years in prison. That sort of thing. So people are losing faith and trust in our institutions, our politicians, our courts, and so on, and less likely to, get into the every man for himself type thing, and less likely to go out of their way to support fellow citizens or look out for fellow citizens or look out for society. You still see it in a wealthier society. There was a guy in a poor part of town. I was driving along, and an older man just keeled over, and nobody cared. The people on the street, there's plenty of them, just walked over him, walked past him. Somebody stopped to see if he had a wallet that they could take his money. But other than that, so there was nowhere to pull over and stop. When I did pull over down the road and came back, someone else had pulled over and doing the same as me, had gone back to help, but no one else did, and no one seemed to care, and they only seemed to want to steal his money if he had any. Now, contrast that, and that obviously it's a low trust sector of society. Now, in the wealthy societies, there's still social trust, in as much as these people are immunized from everything else is going on because they've got more money. They also want their neighbours to look out for them, so they in turn look out for their neighbours. Now, that's an example of social trust and community spirit. So that when there's a dog walking down the road, looking lost, and no one to look after it, that creates a stir. The people in the community are concerned, and they're going out trying to get hold of the dog to see if it's got a phone number where someone could be contacted, and that sort of thing. And it's a matter for concern. That dog needs to be looked after. Now, there are other areas of the city where that dog would be going into a cooking pot, quick smart. So there's different levels of social trust in society depending on where people are, the income they have, and the community esprit de corps that may be. But here's another example of declining community trust. People not giving a shit. We were visiting some friends, and there was a lost dog there that just happened to come along as I was out the front. I was getting out the car, so I grabbed the dog's tag and had a look and called the number that was on it, and a woman answered the phone and said, "Well, that's my boyfriend's dog. We've broken up. He's an asshole. I don't care. So nothing to do with me. Call the dog pound if you want." Hung up. Absolutely didn't care. Now, even if you don't like your boyfriend or you've broken up, wouldn't you want to? Well, look, that's his dog. Here's his address. Could you drop it around? Or here's his phone number. You can call him or something. But just didn't care. So I see that sort of don't care attitude as being a bigger and bigger issue. Now, Some people have mentioned that feminism and things like that have destroyed the West, and there's a strong argument for that. But I think we also need to understand that the people that empowered the feminists to do that destructive work were all straight white males. And we really need to sort of come to grips with that the feminists were empowered by those straight white males to destroy Western society. And in fact, I'll do another video on that shortly. You've been a Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.